Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. My name is Oliver Scott Curry. I'm interested in morality, cooperation, and altruism. And this afternoon, I want to talk to you about a meta-analysis my colleagues and I conducted on the effects of altruism on the altruist, and in particular, whether doing good makes you feel good and whether people are happy to help. So let's start with a couple of big questions. What is happiness and what makes us happy? Well, from an evolutionary point of view, humans have a range of proximate goals, adaptive targets, and happiness is the feeling that we have when we achieve those goals, when we meet those targets. Sarah Hill has a nice quote in a relatively recent review paper where she says, happiness is a psychological reward, an internal signaling device that tells us that an adaptive problem has been solved or is in the process of being solved. So it follows from that if we understand what proximate mechanisms we have, what proximate goals we have, we can predict what would make us happy. So what kinds of things make us happy? Well, we at the basic level, we have adaptations for the 4 Fs, feeding, fighting, fleeing, and sexual intercourse. So it's not surprising from that point of view that eating and having sex make us happy. We find it rewarding, we find it pleasurable. But humans are social animals, and they also have adaptations for different types of cooperation and altruism that motivate them to be kind to help their family, their friends, their allies, and strangers under the right conditions. Strangers might be kin, might be a distant member of your coalition. Strangers might be future reciprocators, or being kind to a stranger might raise your status in the eyes of the audience. So by the same logic, we might expect that acting on these motivations, indulging in our appetite for altruism, being kind to these different people under different conditions, we would find that rewarding as well. We'd find that satisfying. We'd find that it would make us happy. There's plenty of previous research that's consistent with this approach. The Conrath article is a good overview, and there's been some meta-analyses showing, for example, that elderly volunteers tend to be healthier and live longer than elderly non-volunteers. However, the majority of that research is correlational, and obviously we can't use that to establish a causal connection. We don't know whether helping makes people happy, or whether happy people help more, or whether some other variable, for example being healthy, makes people happy and healthy. So what we need are experiments with proper control groups, and there have been plenty of those experiments, and they've received a lot of attention and have caught the eye of policymakers under the heading of positive psychology. But as yet, there's been no meta-analysis of these experiments, so we don't know how reliable or robust the effect is. And so my colleagues and I undertook one. So we followed the usual procedure. We did a keyword search of the relevant databases to pull down all and every experimental study of altruism and well-being, and we contacted researchers in the field to ask for hard to find manuscripts, unpublished manuscripts, and other data sets. That left us with about 500-ish papers. Meta-analyses are great. Don't ever do a meta-analysis. So we had to comb through these 500 papers to look for studies that fit the criteria that we're looking for, our inclusion criteria. And what we wanted was experimental studies where participants were assigned to a helping or a non-helping condition. Studies where the helping condition was behavioural, people were actually doing things as opposed to thinking about doing things or recalling things they'd done in the past. And studies where the well-being or happiness of the participants, of the altruists, was subsequently measured, as opposed to something else being measured, or for example, the happiness of the recipient. When we'd applied those criteria, we ended up with 24 articles, some of which had more than one study, so we had 27 studies. Many of those had more than one dependent variable, so we had 52 effect sizes. And that didn't come out very well, but you're not supposed to. That's just feel the weight, never mind the quality. So for each of these studies, we coded the usual things. We coded characteristics of the sample, the size of the sample, age, the sex composition, where the study was located, what kind of participants they were, and crucially what the intervention was, what the altruism manipulation was, what the control condition was, what kind of dependent measure was used, and obviously ultimately the effect size. And what did we find overall? So when all said and done, in total there were over 4,000 participants, 2/3 of which were female. They were mostly weird students. Most of these studies were conducted with college-age students. There were two main types of interventions: acts of kindness interventions and pro-social spending interventions. The act of kindness interventions, here's an example of one of the instructions. So the participants would be instructed to spend a day or a week sort of going out of their way to do, as it were, random acts of kindness, small altruistic things for other people, and then report back and fill in subsequent questionnaires. The other main intervention was a pro-social spending intervention, where basically the experimenters gave the participants $10, and they were instructed either to spend it on themselves or to spend it on somebody else. There were three main types of control conditions. So earlier studies the control tended to be do nothing, just sort of, as it were, not take part in the manipulation at all. Subsequent studies had a more active control group, so they were doing something that was an attempt to control for the novelty of being involved in a study. So the control conditions were visit 5 new places or take 5 photographs or do something like that. And other studies had a self-help condition, where you were, as in the pro-social spending case, you were spending the money on yourself, so you were doing something to help yourself. There was no systematic variation of recipients, so as those previous instructions show, it was usually left unspecified. The recipients of this help could be anyone. Sometimes the constraints of the study meant it was people at work or people in the same university as you, but generally it was unspecified. And there were a variety of, usually it was a self-report measure of subjective well-being or life satisfaction or positive affect, and with a few exceptions. So those are the study characteristics. In terms of the actual effects, what did we find? Because of the multi-level nature of the data, because there were effect sizes clustered within studies within papers, we used multi-level modelling to estimate the overall effect size, and used a new R package called MetaForest, which is a machine learning-based technique for identifying moderators and coping with these multi-levels, developed by my collaborator Casper van Lisse, who's sitting at the back there, and will be happy to answer all the technical questions you might have about it. So when we ran this, the overall effect size was significant, was an effect size equivalent to a Cohen's d of 0.28. So it's a small to medium overall effect and significant effect of helping on happiness. We found, in addition to that, to the overall effect, we found no evidence of publication bias, as you can see from the funnel plot there, and no significant moderation. So we investigated whether the effects was dependent on the sex composition of the sample, or the age, or the type of intervention or control or outcome measure, and we found that these moderators didn't make very much difference, so the effect was robust across these different types of studies. So that's the basic result. Helping makes you happy with a small to medium effect size of 0.28. This effect size is comparable to other positive psychology interventions like mindfulness or positive thinking or counting your blessings, as documented by these other meta-analyses here. To my mind, the acts of kindness are better value for money than some of these other interventions, because you get 2 for the price of 1. So whereas being mindful might make you a little bit happier, random acts of kindness help make you a little bit happier, and presumably the recipient. So it seems like a good bargain to me. And generally, this meta-analysis supports the the general hypothesis that people are motivated to and derive pleasure from helping others. And to go a little bit further, it seems to me to imply that there's a kindness deficit. So people are only happy to eat if they're hungry. They're not happy to eat if they have a full stomach or if they've already had enough to eat. So the fact that people seem to be happy to help implies that they're not being helpful enough. They're not being kind enough. They're suboptimally helpful, and they could benefit by doing a little bit more. They're perhaps not connected enough. They're perhaps lonely, and by prompting them to act in these ways, they satisfy this appetite that they have. We should all obviously bear in mind the limitations of this body of work, of this literature. Like I said, most of the studies involved weird students, so we don't know how well the effect generalises to other populations, and future research should investigate this with other people in other places. But also, I mean, a bigger and more relevant limitation is the almost complete lack of theory in this literature, and in particular evolutionary theory. So most of the studies were not motivated by any particular study. It was more isn't it curious, isn't it counterintuitive that people might be happy to help, contrary to sort of simplistic rational choice models. And if evolution was mentioned at all, it was mentioned in passing with an out-of-date reference. So although these studies measure the general hypothesis, none of them measure any, test or develop or test any of the more specific hypotheses that might come to mind to an evolutionary informed psychologist. So as a result, we don't know whether different types of people benefit from different types of altruism to different types of recipients. We don't know whether people are happier to help family over friends or friends over strangers. We don't know if people are happier to help in-group over out-group, or unlucky people over unlucky people. We don't know if men are happier to help women or vice versa, or under what conditions. Nor do we know the long-term effects of helping. So obviously the underlying theory is that people find helping rewarding because of the long-term consequences it has for their social relationships. Their families thrive, they have more friends, they have more allies, they gain status and mates. So obviously that's something that could and should be tested. If that's what altruism is for, if that's what cooperation is for, then instead of only measuring immediate subjective happiness, we could look at the long-term consequences of helping on people's social networks. And so there's huge opportunities for evolutionary psychology to make some progress here. And given that many people are studying altruism and cooperation all the time, in this research group, it's a relatively small marginal cost to add to some of those studies measures of subjective well-being, some of which are just, how happy are you, with more complicated variants. So it's a fairly small step from where we are just to add some of these other measures. So if you're interested in doing studies like that, or if you have any ideas on how to do it, then please come and talk to me. I might have some funding that could support it, and I'd be happy to help. Thank you very much.